This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Platka.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on this week?
What the hell is going on is it appears the worm is turning in Ukraine. A lot has happened in the last week or so. First of all, Putin has basically told Trump no when it comes to peace, that he plans to achieve his objectives in Ukraine and he's not going to stop fighting. Trump said at a cabinet meeting that Putin's been bullshitting him and he doesn't want peace. And so Trump spent the first 6 months of his presidency trying to convince and cajole Vladimir Putin to come to the peace table to negotiate an end to the war. And it seems like we've reached the end of the road there. Then, at the same time, while this was all happening, Trump was coming to these conclusions with Putin, the Pentagon paused weapons to Ukraine, and Trump turned them back on. And we've now started delivering Patriot interceptors again that had been paused. We're delivering 155 millimeter artillery that had been paused. We're sort of at a crossroads here in the Ukraine policy of the Trump administration, because what Donald Trump said was, he said this publicly in a number of occasions, that if Ukraine said yes to peace and Vladimir Putin said no, that he would back Ukraine, that he would arm the Ukrainians, that he would impose secondary sanctions on Russia's energy sector and its oil, which is all that's keeping the Russian economy alive. And now I think, one of the things I admire most about Donald Trump is that he does what he said. He said he would,
you admire.
And that could be things you like and things you don't like, right? Like, I'm not a big fan of trade wars, but he said he was going to launch a trade war and he's doing it. And he said that he was not going to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon and they had 60 days to decide. And guess what? He launched Operation Midnight Hammer in coordination with the Israelis and took out Fordo. This is a guy who does what he says. And I think he's going to do what he says.
Well, I hope he does, Mark. I hope he does. I've had my doubts. But I will say this about Donald Trump. You have been talking about writing this article for a while, and I think it's really important for people to understand. There are a lot of people inside the Trump administration that I don't admire for a whole variety of reasons. Frankly, there were a lot of people in the Biden administration I didn't admire either, the president included. But one of the things that strikes me so much in this administration is the people who arrogate to themselves the right to speak for the president. That seems to me to be a huge problem. Now, it's one thing if the president is senile, as Joe Biden was, and in fact, his wife and others conspire to have the people speak for you because you cannot speak for yourself. But these are people who are making
That's
decisions.
not Trump's problem.
Yeah, right. These are people who are making decisions on the president's behalf. These are people who are making decisions that are synchronous with their ideological prejudices, with their views, and they are imputing those views to the president, even though he said the things that you have quoted him saying. And that's what really irritates me. Pete Hegseth has done this more times than I can count on one hand. He may be the greatest guy ever, God knows. This kind of insubordination is not okay. And I think that apart from anything else, yes, I'm really pleased that the president is delivering a strong message to Putin. He gave him the rope to hang himself, and goddamn did Putin hang himself. But I think he needs to deliver a message to his own administration as well, which is enough of the bullshit from you.
I think it's public knowledge that the Pentagon suspended aid to Ukraine. And Trump told, according to the news reports, Trump told Zelensky he had nothing to do with that decision. So it's obvious that that was done without his knowledge and without his authorization, which to me is, I agree with the word you used, insubordination. I think it's rank insubordination. Stopping aid to Ukraine is a presidential decision. It is not a Undersecretary of Defense for Policy decision, or
just to pick a name out of the hat.
Just to pick a name out of a hat, or a Secretary of Defense decision. These are the kinds of decisions that you move up the chain of command to the President of the United States, because he has said his views on these things. And so I think when this this aid pause happened, a lot of folks in the military were wondering whether they were following U.S. policy or USDP policy, which stands for U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And it turns out they were following Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and that's not U.S. policy, and Trump made that clear. But on the other hand, I think Trump has a great self-confidence that he will make the right decisions and that they'll come to him, and so he reversed them. He didn't have any qualms about doing that. I have great confidence that Donald Trump will make the right decisions when presented with the right information and when he's making the decisions. I really had very little doubt that he was going to bomb Iran if the Iranians didn't come to the table. And I have very little doubt that he's not going to back Ukraine now that he's come to the conclusion that Putin is the obstacle to peace. Because for him, it's, whoever's the obstacle to peace gets the pressure. And what I would be doing, quite frankly, Trump always wants to give a pathway to a peaceful solution to all this. I would, quite frankly, be telling Xi Jinping, look, I'm going to pose sanctions on you for buying Russian oil. So if you don't want your oil supply from Russia to be cut off and you don't want those sanctions, you might want to talk to Vladimir about what he's doing in Ukraine and come to the peace table, because you can triangulate Putin with his ally by saying, I'm going to crush the Russian energy industry the way I crushed the Iranian one. And you're going to get caught in the crossfire there. And we've got other trade issues to deal with. So I'd rather not have to do that. So why don't you talk to Vladimir? And I think that would be an effective diplomatic strategy for one last push. It's been described as a reverse Kissinger, right? that you drive a wedge between the Russians and the Soviets, but in a different way than we did in the 70s, where you get the Chinese to be your pressure on the Soviets to either capitulate or face problems with their relationship.
Well, it requires the kind of four-dimensional chess that people talk about Trump playing, sometimes jokingly and sometimes admiringly. So let's hope he does it. Hey, we have a great conversation with somebody who has, I think I feel comfortable in saying, has never disappointed us. General Jack Keane, you're talking to his number one fangirl, and I suspect Mark is one of his number one fanboys as well. General Jack Keane is a four-star general. He completed 37 years of public service, culminating in his appointment as Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He is a recognized foreign policy and national security authority. He is the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, which is our sister institute that works with our own Critical Threats Project. He has been a member of the Secretary of Defense's Policy Board, and he has advised more secretaries of defense and more presidents and more members of Congress of both parties than I can count. He's a treasure.
Here's our interview. Well, Jack, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, delighted to be here with you, Mark and Danny.
Well, it's so great to have you back on. So we want to know what the hell's going on with Ukraine, because there was a aid pause of some kind, and now Trump has said that we're going to start sending weapons. The reason for the pause was reportedly that there was a weapons shortage, but that's called into question now. What is the status of the situation?
Yeah, well, the weapons pause, I understand, was initiated by the Pentagon. I don't believe the president was advised of it, and when he was advised of it, he wanted to understand why that is taking place. And once he got into the why of it, he reversed the policy and committed himself to continue to provide Ukraine military aid. There's also some disputes about weapon systems and shortages, and I'd like to avoid getting into specific weapon systems. I don't think if we're short something, that it's something that government officials should be discussing publicly. Obviously, our adversary is listening, and I don't think they need to know what shortages we may or may not have. But I will say this, that some of the shortages we think we have been resolved, and so that's good news. Based on what I know, we're really quite capable of providing the assistance that Ukraine needs, particularly with air defense systems, and associated with that are air defense systems capable of dealing with ballistic missiles. In the recent two attacks, there was over 500 things in the air. Overwhelming majority of those were drones, but 11 ballistic missiles in the last attack. Nothing on the scale of what we have seen by Iran going into Israel, certainly. But nonetheless, those ballistic missiles, they challenge Ukraine quite a bit. And as a result of that, I'm confident that we'll be getting them the Patriot PAC-3s to be able to assist them. And they also need anti-tank weapons and long-range offensive weapons as well to help sustain their effort. Our audience should understand, when it comes to Ukraine, we're 40-plus months into this war, and while while Putin has made some tactical gains in the last year plus, he hasn't made any operational breakthroughs whatsoever, hasn't taken a major provincial capital or a major city. And you look at a map, it really hasn't changed all that much, although his narrative is that he's making major offensive gains, and it's only a matter of time that Ukraine will indeed be defeated. That is the information campaign he's running domestically, but he's also running it in the United States. And to some degree of effectiveness among people, government officials, and the media in the United States have bought into some of that narrative, that Russia is succeeding and it's inevitable that they will defeat Ukraine. So our audience understands if the United States is providing assistance to Ukraine in the ways that we have been, and the Euros continue to provide their support, Putin cannot take Ukraine, period. That is a fact. If we expand what we're giving to Ukraine and put even more pressure on Putin, and we add sanctions to that, the tough sanctions that Graham and Blumenthal and the Europeans are finally talking about, it is possible that he may come to the negotiating table. We don't know that. We have to wait and see. He may still be stubborn and willing to drag this thing out. I think his strategy that he's had to frustrate the president by dragging out negotiations that have had no end, no positive end, has misfired. The president has manifested his impatience, his frustration. He believes, he said publicly today, that Putin is BSing him, and that's a fact. And he's given every indication that he intends to stick with Ukraine, which will be very frustrating, Putin, because he really wants Trump to walk away. And the evidence we have as of now is that's not happening.
So, Jack, let's just talk a little bit about the state of the war. I think it's important that people understand the details of what you said. That, in fact, while Putin's narrative is he's got all the cards, to use the phrase that the president likes, he's got all the cards, the war is turned in his direction, Ukraine can't win. That's really not the state of play. So maybe if people could understand a little bit about what the state of play is, and I think it's also useful that people understand just how much in the last few months Putin has turned this war into a civilian targeted killing machine. So tell us about what's going on.
Yeah, well, Putin has a couple of objectives in mind. The overall objective is to take control of Ukraine. He has never given that up and put a stooge of his in power like he had once before with Yanukovych back in 2014. And the people ran Yanukovych out of the country into exile into Russia, which began the annexation of Crimea and the invasion into eastern Ukraine. So he wants to return to that, and he's dead set on it. And anybody that thinks that he's given up on this or it's taken too long doesn't understand Putin's motivation. He is staking his presidency on this. Listen, this is the guy who thought he was going to do this in a couple of weeks, that once he brought the Russian army to bear on the capital city and presented it there, he believed that the Ukrainian military, supported by their people, would submit and essentially surrender. And they fought like tigers instead. And they fought decentralized. And he was not able to take the capital city and was quite humiliated in conducting that withdrawal. So they had to reassess as a result of all of that and commit a much larger force. He's got about 300,000 plus on the battlefield. Ukraine's got about 150,000 plus on the battlefield, and he's taking significant amount of casualties, close to 1 million, over 300,000 dead. Then the other 700,000 or 800,000 have been wounded. Ukraine admits to about 30,000 dead. Institute for a Study of War estimates it's closer around 60, maybe to 70,000 KIA, but we don't know for a fact, but that's just kind of tracking public sources. This is a bloody war for sure, and Putin is committed to wearing down Ukraine militarily, but also wearing down its people. He's brought in a war of attrition here, and drone warfare on the front lines is the dominating factor. The Ukrainians have built in the last year close to 2 million drones. In this coming year, it'll likely be closer to 3 to 4 million. The Russians' numbers aren't as great, but nonetheless significant. And so our audience understand a battalion has about 600 people in it, and on a given day, there could be 300 to 400 drones supporting that one organization. Quite remarkable in and the change of character of war. If you're a soldier carrying an anti-tank shoulder weapon that can knock out a tank or an armored vehicle, if you can be seen like that soldier with that shoulder-fired weapon or an AK-47, you can be killed. If you're a tank, you can be killed. If you're an artillery piece, you can be killed. If they find a command and control center, which is a headquarters where the officers and NCOs gather to make the plans and supervise the war, if they find that, it can be eliminated. So that is how drone warfare has changed war. They have drones that go out and find things, and then they have killer drones that they drive right into whatever it is they're trying to destroy, and it blows up. And some have larger explosives on it, medium-sized, small, depending on what they're targeting. So the frontline battle is casualty producing. Putin was averaging in the high 30,000s all of last year. He's now in the mid-range of 40,000 casualties. This is per month. Ukraine's numbers are considerably less, but nonetheless growing in size. And we don't talk about their numbers, but they're nowhere near what Putin's casualties are. And a lot of that has to do with the Ukrainians being better trained, better disciplined, although we are seeing now soldiers coming to the front in Ukraine who have not had adequate basic training, the length of time to acquire all the necessary skill sets. And that is because of the pressure that they have on manpower, and they need to get those soldiers to the front. So on the front lines, it's a bloody war out there. Artillery still makes a big difference as well. When drones find a target, they can shoot it down with other drones, or they can drop artillery on it. The Russians have more artillery than Ukraine has. But then, as Danny mentioned, Putin has another objective, not just to wear down Ukraine's frontline forces, but to defeat the people at home in terms of their will, in supporting the war itself. And that is why he is committing a war crime by targeting civilians time and time again. And not only civilians, he knows there are emotional targets out there. And this is something he did in Syria, in Aleppo, when they killed literally hundreds of thousands of people. And they clearly went after emotional targets like hospitals and schools. And they are purposely targeted. If they get caught at it, they'll say, well, that was an accident, that was a misfire. They're actually targeting that. They want to break the will of the Ukrainian people, who are remarkably steadfast despite what is taking place in their everyday life. And as to Zelensky, their leader, I mean, this is a man who rose to power after having been a popular figure on television in a situation comedy and displayed some leadership ability and was propped up by his party that he had a legitimate shot at becoming president, and he won. And now he finds himself to be a wartime president. And he exhibited remarkable leadership in rallying his country, but also rallying the international community to support him. And he has been dealing with this now for 40 plus months as a wartime president. We have no frame of reference for that in our own history, where we've been invaded and we have a president defending against an invader for 40 months. We have a president who was at war for that time frame, and certainly that was Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, which was horrific in terms of casualties. But Zelensky and even Churchill, who we talk about quite a bit, and Roosevelt, they didn't have that kind of experience. But Churchill had an air campaign run against him by the Nazis. Thank God they didn't invade, because they would have defeated the Brits, likely. But even he was only dealing with an air campaign. So we don't have a frame of reference in our country for what Zelensky is embracing emotionally, psychologically. Mark and I both have had the privilege to deal with some of his leadership around him. They talk about the president being exhausted, and that he goes to the front on a regular basis. He sees his troops in the hospital. He has friends and family, all have been touched by this war, and he still embraces it emotionally and doesn't isolate himself from it. So he takes all of that on. I have a lot of regard for his steadfastness, his moral courage, and physical courage in leading his nation in wartime. I know he's a controversial figure. I got all of that. I have a lot of toleration, for some of his excesses, and when he gets emotional and he gets angry. I mean, he is facing a huge existential threat, just like Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing with the Iranians. It has a tendency to focus your mind somewhat, and his mind is certainly focused, and so are his emotions. But those two campaigns are major campaigns, Danny and Mark. One, the ground campaign to wear down the Ukrainian forces, take significant territory, which they have not been able to do, and defeat the Ukrainian people by targeting them and killing them and wounding them and going after hospitals and children. And every indication we have to date is while the Ukrainians want a ceasefire, President Zelensky wants a ceasefire, they are not backing away from support for their troops fighting the Russians. Listen, their father fathers, their grandfathers, they lived under communism. They know what this deal is. And they understand what Russia is going to do to them if they take their country over. That's why they were looking to the West in terms of economic benefit in the European Union. This is back prior to 2014 in the so-called orange protests that were going on. They wanted to be associated with the West, and they wanted the political and military alliance of NATO as well. They were not looking to the east towards Russia, and that was frustrating the hell out of Putin. And it's one of the reasons that drives him to this day, and that is he feels threatened by that thriving democracy that exists in a country of significant size and prosperity. And that is a threat to him and his communist authoritarian regime. And he sees it, and he wants to stop it, and he wants to take control of it. And that's kind of what's at stake here.
I want to drill down on something you said at the start, which is that Putin cannot win if we don't abandon Ukraine. Because one of the arguments that you hear from those who want to disengage from the Ukraine war is that the longer Trump gives weapons to Ukraine, the more it becomes Trump's war, and that this is not Trump's war, this is Biden's war, and they don't want this to become Trump's war. And I think the answer to that is that it only becomes Trump's war if Putin wins on his watch. Then it becomes his Afghanistan. And so talk to me about what do you make of that argument and what's the answer to it?
Yeah, well, I think it is Trump's war because the United States policy that he's executing is still to support Ukraine. And so therefore he has a stake in the outcome. He has committed to that. If Ukraine is lost because we pull away, that outcome strategically would be a disaster for Europe, and also it would significantly embolden our allies, particularly China, if the United States was to pull away. I think right now the president has the wind at his back somewhat. Israel took the initiative to deal with the Iranians after they decimated Hezbollah and Hamas, and the United States pushed back on the Houthis, and he felt the time was right. He had the military capability to go after their nuclear enterprise and their ballistic missile enterprise, and President Trump made a decisive decision to help complete the destruction of their nuclear enterprise, which captured the imagination of the world, given the types of weapons we were using to do that, the air stealth bombers that nobody else in the world owns but the United States in accomplishing that mission. So we have militarily defeated Iran, Israel-led U.S.-supported operation, and Iran is back on its heels in a way they've never been since the regime was formed. And out of that came deterrence, a return to deterrence for our adversaries. And I think the president has a wind at his back. I think he knows he made the right decision in supporting Israel conducting that strike, and was willing to overcome whatever fear of failure he may have had in his own mind. Those are the kind of things that have paralyzed his predecessors. Obama was always paralyzed by the fear of adverse consequence, and I think Biden much the same. Trump was getting the same thing. Oh, if you support Israel and attack Iran, you're going to expand the war. This is going to become a regional war. Other people even went further to say this is going to be World War III. Some people who were saying that were close to the president, as a matter of fact. But he looked at all of that coldly and likely concluded that's not realistic. There's a bad thing that's happening here. I intend to stop it, much as he stopped the bad thing of Assad having chemical weapons, or Qasem Soleimani death and destruction campaign that existed for multiple decades to include the United States, killing of our people through multiple decades. Stop those bad things, good things can come from it. And his instincts about that are correct, and good things are coming from that very thing. We've got to stop Putin. If Putin takes control of Ukraine, takes its resources, takes all of its modern technology that has made it there's not a country in Europe that could stand up against the Ukraine military machine today. None. Not one of them. In fact, if they formed together, they would have difficulty dealing with it. That's how capable this military force is. You combine that capability with Russia, and he will absolutely, after rebuilding and strengthening it, he would clearly expand. He would have the wind at his back after the United States pulls away, and think he has a clear pathway to what he's always wanted, and that is to take back these countries who got under the umbrella of NATO, fearing that Russia at some point would come for them again to make them part of the Russian Empire. That was very good decisions on their part to become a part of NATO, but he wants to break NATO, and he wants to take back some of those countries in doing that. So that objective is phase 2. Phase 1 is take control of Ukraine, its resources, its technology, its innovation, and use that and its own military and what they've learned to overwhelm these much smaller Eastern European countries and put the existence of NATO at risk. And he's hoping that the United States accommodates him by pulling away. I don't believe that's going to happen, and it would be an absolute disaster. Mark, you're absolutely right. It would be a repeat of Afghanistan, where we walked away and put at risk turning the country over to the very adversary we were fighting. And while people see the chaos that took place on those several days in an emergency retreat, I think the thing our adversaries learned from that was the judgment involved in taking so much risk with an adversary while we were supporting the Afghan government and its military for close to 20 years and willing just to walk away and say, okay, we've had enough, and knowing full well that without air support and without the 3 CIA bases and the 7 military bases we had there, the risk would be high that Taliban could retake control. And we walked away from that. Our adversaries saw that as a failure in judgment and turning the very country over to the enemy we were fighting. In other words, the United States just surrendered. Who could not conclude that is weakness? And if we walked away from Ukraine, we would be displaying that kind of strategic weakness once again. And our adversaries clearly would take advantage of it, much as they did.
Like Xi in Taiwan. Xi might take that as a sign that he can take Taiwan.
Oh, yeah, I truly believe that. You know, we have President Xi, 12 years in position, has said time and time again that they intend to take control of Taiwan. They've been using intimidation and coercion to get them to voluntarily submit. There's been no sign that they will, and no sign now that they will. Quite the contrary, as a matter of fact. They are a thriving, democratic, capitalistic state that is empowered with technology and innovation. I've been there many times, provided some assistance to the president of Taiwan, President Tsai, for a number of years, found the culture to be fascinating, and loved talking to the Taiwanese kids, the college kids and others who would go over to China to see it. And they always loved coming home because right below the surface, when they started to talk, you know how the college kids are, they're all going to be honest with one another. And they would get, after a drink or two, they would get unloaded on by these young people about what it was like living under surveillance, what it was like living under repression, what it was like listening to them whisper so nobody at another table could hear what they were saying about this communist regime and how much they were embedded in their lives and how it truncates them in terms of their future happiness and lack of freedom and how much they envy other countries who have it. So, yeah, the Taiwanese are fascinating people who live 100 miles away from an authoritarian repressive regime who has real designs on them. So Xi has told his military to be ready by 27 to take the island by force. He's threatened it, so he's preparing his military for it, and he's threatening to do it. I think, given what we know about history, when these dictators make statements like that, we should likely take them seriously. They have a tendency to follow through on. History tells us that. And we have an erosion of our military capability there because of the atrophy associated with the 9/11 wars and the Obama budgets and the erosion that it cost us. We got a long way to go to rebuild that deterrence. We've taken a step a little bit psychologically for sure as a result of our success dealing with Iran. We have got to put it together and get real capability on the ground so that President Xi, when he sees it, that capability, and particularly as military people look at it, they see that the outcome would not be certain, that they're willing to get into this and take high casualties to people and to capital assets, ships, airplanes, missile batteries, and the like, likely willing to do that if they knew they were going to win. But if it's in doubt, because Taiwan is empowered significantly, much more than they are today, and there are some increases going on, and the U.S. and ally capability has increased, we don't have to go platform to platform with these guys, but if we have enough capability to be credible and put the outcome in doubt, that's deterrence. But we're not there, and we got work to do in that sphere as well. And these people who argue that, well, Keane, you just made the argument why we got to get out of Ukraine. Why China should be a major priority for us, why we shouldn't be giving Ukraine weapons that we need to do in China. But you've got to see the relationship. The most fundamental change from Trump 1 to Trump 2 in the world is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea collaborating, coordinating together as partners, not the strength as homogeneous allies that exist in NATO, but as partners in a common purpose and a common objective. objective, and that is to change the United States and like-minded democracies' dominance in the world so they can accomplish their sphere of influence in the world for their own national interests. And that is a major geopolitical shift than anything we've seen, and it presents danger to us on a scale we have not seen since World War II, because we could be involved in war in multiple theaters as a result of it. So you have to connect the dots. This is not all about China. This is about the Middle East and putting down Iran, and hopefully people understand that so much better now after witnessing what we've been going through since October the 7th and the invasion and the decapitation of the proxies and the pushback on the Iranians, and also what is going on in Europe. These two strategic geographic areas, the Middle East and Europe, matter to world stability, and they are of vital national interest to the United States. It cannot be all about China. If that happened, China wins, because if Russia wins in Ukraine, China wins as well. And the United States would have major problems about this. Just think about this. The people who want to pull out of Europe and put all our eggs in one basket against China, if Russia had its way in Ukraine then as a result of that, and Europe is being threatened and we're a part of NATO, it is likely that President Trump or his successor would have to put more forces to Europe than we have now. Why is that? Because Russia's coming. They've just taken Ukraine. And what we have would not be adequate to defend against that. We would have to increase our capability there, not just a defensive capability. We'd have to put in some offensive capability to deal with that kind of a threat. So it takes away this argument, which I've always found to be quite shallow, that the priority has to be China at the expense of the Middle East and Europe. Makes no sense. I think it's shallow thinking, to be frank about it.
You know, we agree with you completely about that. I want to ask you about the change of heart that the president has had, or apparently had. So when President Trump was elected, I think that he genuinely believed that he had relationships with both Xi Jinping and with Vladimir Putin that could bring an end to the conflict. And people who, I don't know Donald Trump, certainly I don't know him the way that you and Mark do, but he has always been very focused on civilian casualties. He's always been very focused on the costs of war. He talked about that before he hit Syria and the chemical weapons attack. So I understand that there was a desire to bring a rapid ending to the conflict, but Putin didn't want that to happen, and Putin wasn't the friend that I think Trump believed. How do we measure this going forward? Apparently, the president now supports Lindsey Graham's very strict sanctions bill that he introduced that has, I think, 83 or 84 co-sponsors in the Senate. What do you see as the position of the Trump administration in this war?
Yeah, well, in dealing with the president's emphasis on personal diplomacy, certainly the degree that he involves himself in that is probably a little disproportionate to many of his predecessors. But he believes strongly in it because he's negotiated so much in his own business life. He didn't delegate that a lot to others. He did it himself. And he has a lot of confidence in himself. And I think in doing it, he felt establishing a relationship to begin with is important to getting a deal where both sides feel there is benefit to it. So that is the going in premise, that I want to have a good relationship with this person, and that could possibly lead to a better deal or to a deal itself because of the relationship. Countries have a tendency to operate in their own national interest primarily. And while relationships are important to leaders, certainly relationships with allies and partners and also with adversaries, so tough things can maybe be resolved, most of them do not pursue it to the degree that President Trump does. He's literally committed to it. And that is who he is as President of the United States. And that is not going to change. It is a fact, in my view, in looking at this. But as we can see, the relationship with Mr. Putin has soured. And the president is very vocal about it. He always knew that Putin is a thug and a killer, and he knows he's committed war crimes. He chooses not to talk about any of that. People think, well, what's going on? There's some special deal there? What's happened? Why do they have a relationship? Why doesn't he come out and call Putin a thug and killer? I get this when I make speeches. You call him a thug and a killer on a regular basis, Keane. Why doesn't the president see that? Well, of course he sees that. He does see it. But he believes that if he attacks him publicly, that will taint the ability of a positive relationship to get positive results. That is how he approaches it. But this is isn't open-ended, as we can see. I do think the president underestimated, and I think he would admit this himself, the challenge dealing with Mr. Putin. The Putin he dealt with in Trump 1 is different than the Putin he's dealing with in Trump 2. Putin in Trump 2 is a wartime commander. His presidency is at risk here. His very life is likely at risk here if he fails. Making a deal would not necessarily be failure. But if he fails and the Russian army was destroyed as a result of that, Putin knows he has major, major challenges. So he talks to the president. Yes, Mr. President, I want the same thing you want. I want peace. I want this war to stop. I want the killing to stop, just like you do. I want us to have the economic relationship we used to have, which has mutually benefited both of our countries. This is kind of the talk, and it's much more than that. And there's a bit of a friendship there in the relationship. But Putin's rope has run out with the president. He obviously knew he was being played, but he still thought that he could get him to the negotiating table, and it has not worked. And I think where the president is, he knows he's got to help Ukraine defend itself, and he's got to impose some tough sanctions on Putin. I think he also understands the limitations that sanctions may have, because Putin has always worked around them. They take a little longer to take effect, but nonetheless, they will hurt Putin, and that puts additional pressure on him. Battlefield effects, though, is number one for Putin. What happens on the battlefield matters, much more so than what's going on with him economically. He always believes he can handle that economic thing. And believe me, history is on his side in terms of the evidence of how he's handled it. Now, what they have in mind this time is much tougher in terms of sanctions, and there are secondary sanctions in there as well for any country that's doing business with him, which would include China and India, and that would really matter. So yeah, this relationship has taken a turn. You're absolutely right about that. There's a public display of it, and as a result of it, the president has a hardened position, in my mind is the way I would describe it, in supporting Ukraine and getting on with that, making certain that the weapons delivery is taking place, that the pause the Pentagon had in mind because of significant shortages, I think those impediments have been removed. The Pentagon's been told to get on with it, and likely that's all happening as we speak. But yeah, I don't think, Danny, he's going to give up on the personal diplomacy piece. He still talks about President Xi. I've got a good relationship with him. He's my friend. The same kind of narrative that he had with Putin, because he's got economic tariffs to deal with and other things to deal with, increasing support to Taiwan, working closer with our allies in the region, increasing military capabilities in the region, all of which have the potential to strain that relationship. So I think he likely learned some things dealing with Putin, but I don't think it will fundamentally change his approach to personal diplomacy and how having a positive relationship with an adversary has a possibility and likelihood to contribute to a much better deal with that adversary.
I think you're right, Jack, in that he even after Operation Midnight Hammer, he still immediately offered the chance for Iran to negotiate. Like, he never gave up on personal diplomacy even while he was bombing the Iranians. So I don't think that he's going to give up on the prospect of personal diplomacy with Putin. But if you were advising the president, what would the pivot be now? So he's come to the conclusion that Putin is bullshitting him, as he put it, in the cabinet room, and that he doesn't want peace. And so the two things he said was he was going to sanction the hell out of them, and he was going to arm Ukraine even more. Put some meat on the bones of what that should look like if you were designing the strategy to force Putin back to the table through pressure, of military and economic pressure.
I think what has to happen, the administration has got to arm wrestle among itself, among the key actors here, in terms of what is a strategy going forward that would be favorable to the United States in terms of our interest and also Ukraine's interest. After all, we used to criticize the Biden administration, you, me, and Danny, for not having a strategy. His strategy was as long as it takes, right? And then he metered the kinds of weapons going in because he feared escalation by Putin, which proved to be quite unfounded and detrimental to Ukraine. We'd be in a different situation if we had given Ukraine everything they needed when they needed it in terms of where we would be on the battlefield today. So the administration has been in power now almost 6 months, and I think they really got to put together a strategy for themselves and get everybody in the administration on the same page. I don't think they're there. I mean, you have people that say, well, yeah, we got to help Ukraine, but also this is a European problem. China has to have a priority. I mean, there's different viewpoints in the administration. And you can see it play out in the media as a result of it. I think what the president is doing as a result of this weapons pause, and actually the fact that it happened, I see it as a positive thing because it walked its way into the White House. What's going on here? The media is telling the president that the weapons have stopped flowing to Ukraine. And, well, he didn't make that decision. What's happening? So I think post-Iran, focus of the mind on Ukraine is taking place, and also some kind of normalization deals in the Middle East. I think it's fertile ground for major strategic improvement in the Middle East. And as you know, I mean, the president's ability to multitask is pretty significant, dealing with complicated things. But it has focused the mind on Ukraine where we were not a number of weeks ago. In my mind, what needs to take place is not just to continue to provide the weapons to Ukraine, but actually a strategic commitment to them, to make certain that Ukraine is capable of defending itself against Russia and actually capable of making some tactical gains. I'm not saying to drive the Russians all out of the Donbass region or to drive them out of Crimea, but give them the capability to get into better terrain and push the Russians off of terrain that's very favorable to a long-term occupation for them. But making it a matter of making a commitment to them. And the Ukrainians understand it, the Euros understand it, who will keep that, will obviously be encouraged by that, and will keep providing assistance. And then we obviously get Congress to support it as well. The funding and drawdowns that are taking place now run out in August. So there is a policy decision coming into what to do about that. That's next month. So meetings now taking place are important meetings, I think, in defining what is our strategy, what is the end state that we're looking for here, and getting the entire administration on the same page in doing that. Not just the military piece of it, but the economic piece of it, the diplomatic and the political piece of all of it in a coherent strategy going forward. I think that is really critical. And the underlying foundation for that is the commitment to Ukraine, that we're going to support them and meet their needs as much as we have the capability to do that. And that's got to be said publicly, it's got to be said to Zelensky, etc. I would love to see the president go to Ukraine. I think it would make a big difference to make a secret trip to see the people up close. He's a compassionate person. He feels other people suffering, and I think it would be helpful for the people of Ukraine to know that he was there among them and that he cared, and take them to the 4 sites where there are mass graves. He doesn't have to go to all 4, but brief him on all 4 and take them to 1 or 2 of them that are the closest to Kyiv, and let them see the genocide that has been inflicted on innocent people. We're not talking about soldiers now. We're talking about innocent people. And come to grips with the Ukrainian people and their moral courage and what they're standing for, and they're fighting for their very existence of their families and their way of life. I think that would be an important personal dimension for him that would help strengthen his own personal resolve in dealing with this issue. But I think the administration is coming to grips with this, and I'm hopeful that strategy that makes sense in terms of commitment to Ukraine comes out of it. There's reasonable end states to achieve it, and that we put enormous pressure on Putin economically, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. And I think that would put us in much better shape than where we are right now.
I think that's a great idea. I think you and Mark should take him. So I have an exit question from you. Hey, I'll come too if you want, but he and I are not yet friends.
200 Secret Service along with us.
That's for sure. So exit question from me. What does winning look like for Ukraine? Can Ukraine win? Can Russia be pushed back? And can we get there?
Yeah, winning doesn't look like it would in a normal sense. It's still possible, but to drive them off their territory, that's obviously a battlefield win. I think that's unlikely, but possible. More realistically, what it looks like is Putin is denied the ability to win, and it protracts the war for him. And he has issues coming with involuntary mobilization, and he has industrial mobilization issues as well. And those 2 things are major factors for him. He is really counting on the fact that his progress will increase, Trump will pull away, and he'll only have to deal with the Euros military assistance. And over time, he can avoid the involuntary mobilization, which will cost him politically, and also the industrial mobilization, which will hit him economically as well. So he has headwinds in front of him. And that is why the pressure points make makes so much sense. And that would force him to reassess his situation. Why would I continue to do this when I'm losing political support as a result of having the major mobilization of people on my hands to deal with the casualties? The North Koreans by themselves aren't going to solve this problem, and when they start to come again. And the economic woes. Right now the people are still supporting him, but he knows that can change. Now, he's a student of what happened in the Afghanistan war, and he saw that happen when the people forced the government to change, and because it looked hopeless. And that's what we got to get to here, is that Putin, when he sees his goals not being achievable at all, he's not going to be able to take Ukraine because of the military support and the economic sanctions on him, the political opposition, the isolation he's suffering as a result of it. And also, likely, some sense of China starting to have problems here themselves, dealing with Putin and the continued support that he demands from them, because they are providing significant support to him. So it's something less than driving him out of there, although there is still that potential there that his forces could begin to break down, as we know, because they're not properly trained, they're not properly led. And with increased equipment and capabilities, Ukraine may be able to make some tactical gains that could lead into operational gains. But I'm not optimistic about that. But it is possible. I wouldn't take it off the board. In other words, they could drive all military out of Crimea just with long-range fires, just as they destroyed the Black Sea Navy and drove them out of the Black Sea. They could do the same. And they could take significant portions of the Donbass region and start pushing the Russians back towards the sea. That is possible, but I think it's still unlikely given where we are in the war. But I wouldn't rule it out with expanded capability to Ukrainians and the long-term pressure on Russian troops, their leadership, their morale, and the high casualty rates, and what that could do in terms of providing opportunities to the Ukrainians. So I think that's kind of where we are. And so that would mean Putin has to make a choice. Does he continue to be part of this war of attrition and putting his presidency at stake, or does he cut a deal to take the pressure off of him, from the internal pressure off of him? And I think that's certainly somewhat achievable if we have the resolve to continue to support and indeed expand it, and we commit to the Ukrainians. President Trump really matters here when it comes to Putin, in my mind. And if that commitment is there and Putin interprets that as being strong resolve, I think things begin to change as a result of it.
Exit from me. I agree with you, Jack. And I think that victory is the status quo today for Ukraine, which is why Putin won't agree to peace, because his goal was to take Ukraine. If he, after 3 years of fighting and ISW estimates 70,000 KIA, however many, injured, has only gained about 8% of Ukraine's territory, that's defeat. He didn't achieve his goals, which I think is why he's so stubborn about not negotiating and not ending it, because if he ended it today, it would be a Ukrainian victory. They saved their country. They survived. He gained very little territory at great expense. So I think right now, if you froze the conflict where it is today, that would be a defeat for Putin.
Yeah, I don't dispute it, because his objective is to take control of Ukraine. That's what he's advertised. That's what's flowing on state TV all the time. And that's why they take a page out of Hitler and the Nazis, why they refer to them as fascists, as Nazis. And they have horrible descriptions of them in terms of describing them like animals. I'm talking about the Ukrainian people. They denigrate them to make them subhuman. And they poison the minds of the Russians in terms of some moral justification for what the Russians are doing here, much as Hitler was doing, to Europeans writ large, and particularly focusing on the Jews. But it was Europeans writ large as well. And he cannot take Ukraine and accomplish his goals if we continue to support them. That's a fact. And he knows that. So you're absolutely right. Things begin to change as a result of that. And he'll have to make a reassessment. And how long is he going to stay in this thing, knowing he can't win? Right now, he thinks he can, because he believes he can break the will of the United States government and its people, and eventually undermine the Europeans as well, and he'll have his way and be able to take the country. But if we show him that's not going to happen, he has to reassess. He doesn't have much choice.
From your mouth to God's ears, let's make this happen.
God bless.
Thank you,
God
Jack,
bless.
as always.
Always good talking to you guys and your audience, too. Take care.
You're a national treasure, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
All right. All right, Danny, what do you think? Other than that Jack Keane is a national treasure.
Yeah, well, I said that already. So, look, our boss, Corey Shaki, always likes to use the expression very flatteringly that somebody has conducted a masterclass. And I think that for us was a masterclass in understanding not just what's at stake, what the outcome looks like. Jack is no Pollyanna. And that's really important because I think there are Pollyannas out there who are good people, who believe in Ukraine, and who think that there can be a better outcome than there is going to be, even if we do all the right things, simply because we lost the plot so early on in the Biden administration. But I think, if Donald Trump stays the course, if he supports what is necessary, and if Congress supports what's necessary, I just sent you a text, Mark, about the head of the Freedom Caucus saying we need to help Ukraine defend itself, which I thought was what I call progress, then I think we really have turned a corner, and this could be really, really important, not just in winning that war, but in deterring China and Iran and North Korea and our other enemies. What do you think?
Yeah, so I agree with you. And look, we just restored deterrence with the strikes with Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran. If we abandon Ukraine, we lose all the gains we made in that deterrence, right? The Chinese will look and say, oh, he was willing to hit a weakened Iranian country that didn't have nuclear weapons, but the United States didn't have the stamina to help Ukraine, so that means they're not going to help us. They're not going to help Taiwan either. And so all the things we were worried about Taiwan, we're not worried about anymore because the U.S. cut and ran. I don't think there's a chance that's going to happen. I think Trump, I said it at the beginning and I'll say it at the conclusion, he does what he says. And I think what we need with the process that really needs to take place is not so much a deliberative process within the Trump administration of coming up with a strategy, but it's the Trump administration getting behind Donald Trump's strategy, which should be self-evident, but apparently is not. Trump has made clear what he would do in this circumstance. If Putin said no and Ukraine said yes, he was going to back Ukraine. And so now it's time to back Ukraine. It's that simple. And the goal is still what Trump was from the beginning, force Putin to the table to stop the war. I don't think, I think even Jack says that it's very unlikely that Ukraine can make the kind of territorial gains that would be strategically significant, though it's possible, but unlikely. And so we're not talking about a war to help Ukraine regain all of its territory. We're talking about imposing costs on Russia that make Putin rethink his refusal to end the war. And I think that's a doable, a very achievable goal.
As long as it's on the right terms, right?
Well, I know, but that's where we were going, where Trump was trying to take it diplomatically. I know some of our friends like Fred would say that these lines are not great, and there's all sorts of military reasons why these are not ideal. If we were to end the war today with the lines that we have right now, it would be a huge Ukrainian victory and a huge Russian defeat, which is why I think Putin is not agreeing to it, because he set a goal of taking Ukraine, and he controls a little bit less than 20% of the territory right now. He already controlled about 14% of it before the war started because he had Crimea, right? So to have gained 8% of the territory in 3 years at the cost to his economy, the cost of lives, the cost in treasure, the cost in everything like that, any objective military observer would say, boy, dude, you cut off more than you could chew and you weren't able to do it. That would be a huge, huge defeat. And so that's why I think he's reluctant. He's not going to do this willingly. He's got to be forced to the table. And the way you force him is by, and I want to clarify one thing, because Jack and I wrote a big essay in the Post a few months ago explaining how we can arm Ukraine without taxpayer money. We're not talking about going back to the Biden supplementals and having the American taxpayers foot the bill for this. Ukraine can buy these weapons. They can buy it with loans that are guaranteed by their natural resources. We have the great minerals deal that Trump signed. That can be a source of revenue for that. You've got $300 billion in Russian assets that are frozen mostly in Europe that can be used to buy weapons. There's lots of ways for the American taxpayer to not have to pay for this. And quite frankly, we'd have the benefit of having a huge cash infusion into our defense industrial base, which is what we need. That is not taxpayer funded. Let's let Putin rebuild the U.S. defense industrial base. There's $300 billion sitting out there, and why not send it into the United States economy? I think that would be a great outcome for the United States in addition to Ukraine. So that's my theory. It is mine.
It is mine, and it is yours. And hopefully it will. Well, you're doing good work. You're doing good work talking to him on these topics whenever he reaches out. And so far, it's been a good week. So, yay. Take care, everybody. Good
See you next week.
Weeks. It's true. A good summer.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.